Charcha 2020 is a platform for the development sector, and we're very excited to have a track on land and property. So, and bring in very diverse voices here. So today's session right now is focused on gender and land, and we're very lucky to be joined by one of the most eminent voices in the field, Dr. Bina Agarwal, who's a professor of development economics and environment at the University of Manchester in UK. Earlier, she was the director of the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. Of course, we all know her as having written the pioneering book, A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia in 1994. And her latest book on gender challenges is a 3-volume compendium of her selected papers. In the land community particularly, we also know her as having spearheaded a big campaign to amend the Hindu Succession Act in 2005 to make it more gender equitable, which led to multiple awards, including the Padma Shri in 2008 and multiple other international awards. So we're really, I think, privileged to have her on the panel here. We will also have Raksha, who has been reporting on land for the longest time, land, forest rights, and many other such issues. And we will have her in conversation with Dr. Agarwal today. The session will also be streaming live as we on YouTube and a number of other feeds. So just letting all the participants know and the panelists know. Raksha, I'll hand it over to you. But Professor Agarwal, if we could have your video, perhaps we can get the session started.
I am on video.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. I'll hand it over to Raksha and you to take it from here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shalmali. Thank you so much. You've kind of eased us into this, so I don't need to reintroduce Dr. Agarwal to everybody listening in. We can jump right into the discussion, so thank you so much. One of the things that I'm pretty sure is top of the mind for everybody tuning in here is the current crisis that we find ourselves in, the COVID crisis. So it's but obvious that we start a discussion right from there. So Professor Agarwal, if I could just ask you to place this issue of women's access to land within the larger COVID crisis during the COVID period, and we can take it forward from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Shalmoli. Thanks, Raksha, and I look forward to this charcha. You know, anything that we look at for any crisis, COVID or other, the impact of it is embedded in pre-existing inequalities. So I think in a way, I'll say a few words for a start. Why is land so important, for the poor, for women? It's really the most important productive resource and form of wealth in India. It affects not just economic well-being, but also we know it affects political power and social status. So gender inequalities in land ownership should be treated really as foundational in terms of looking at economic inequalities between women and men. And I emphasize this because we have a lot of focus, both pre-COVID and during the COVID period on jobs, but also in the pre-COVID period, you'll remember there's been a huge discussion for many years on labor force participation rates, and especially women's declining labor force participation in India. And of course that's important, but labor force participation rates don't tell us what women earn. They don't tell us very much about their ability to have a livelihood. And in particular, it ignores the assets that are needed to have a livelihood. And land and asset ownership is therefore very important. And I might also add that when we talk of men's economic status, we always take into account ownership of wealth and land. I think that's a reminder that for women also, it's jobs are important, but also the ownership of a very fundamental resource like land. And agricultural land is especially important. So for women, because some 30% of our farmers and farm workers are women, and 73% of rural women workers relative to only 55% of rural male workers are in agriculture. So as men migrate to cities, as we've seen, the extent of it, even in the visual images, as they migrate for jobs, effectively women are managing the farms, but they rarely own the land that they manage. Also, if they don't have titles, they don't get easy access to credit and so on. But in addition, there is an overall gender bias which women face in terms of the obstacles in accessing government subsidies, technological inputs, training, and markets. So during the COVID lockdown, while millions of male migrants were left stranded in cities and many of them are still stranded, these women farmers had little labor support or remittances. And of course, as we know, the press has reported a great deal on male farmers, but it has not mentioned, to my knowledge, women farmers. Another element is that mortality under COVID-19 is higher among men so far, and this will leave many women widowed or vulnerable. And many households will also become female-headed households, and we have a lot of evidence that female-headed households tend to be much poorer. But if they owned land, they could survive the crisis and revive their livelihoods in the post-COVID period. So I think that's really by way of background that it's in any crisis, if you lose your major asset, suppose you were a vendor in the street, you had to sell your cart or you had to sell your rickshaw. How would you survive? So similarly, if you don't have land in rural areas, if you're not owners of land, then it's very difficult to revive your livelihood.
Right, and I know that you made a distinction between women owning land and women's access to land, and we'll definitely come back to that because I think it's an extremely crucial distinction, especially given the kind of economic situation that we'll all find ourselves in, or have already found ourselves in. But just to move on, to try and understand the whole idea of women's ownership, since we've kind of gone down that path. I know that you pioneered the issue of women's land rights. You also wrote a book, A Field of One's Own. It is a 1994 book, and have continued writing and have continued your advocacy on the subject. So can we basically try and understand the result, what has changed as a result of your campaign in, let's say, 2005 to amend the Hindu Succession Act, and successive writing and advocacy efforts that you've made?
Okay, thank you. I just want to flag one other thing, that since I wrote A Field of One's Own, the other research also showed a close link between women owning property and their security against domestic violence. So we found, for instance, that women who owned either land or house the incidence of domestic violence was hugely less. So I just wanted to add that. Now, since I wrote A Field of One's Own, and remember it's 26 years ago, a great deal has changed. The immediate impact, of course, was that in terms of national and international awareness about the issue. And there have also been major changes in government policy and inheritance laws. But the effect has been limited in terms of women actually getting land on the ground through these means. So on awareness, for instance, today, everybody recognizes the importance of land rights for women. You talk to researchers, you talk to governments, NGOs, the United Nations, other international bodies like Oxfam, ActionAid, and so on. People are very aware that this is an extremely important issue. It was embedded in SDG 5 on gender inequality, the Sustainable Development Goals 5. It's a major target in that. And so since 1994, the awareness of this has really widened and widened in concentric circles. Government policy too, I will say, has moved forward. So if you looked at the distribution of titles when they were being distributed in the 60s and 70s under anti-poverty programs, the 1 hectare of land or 1 acre of land all went to male-headed households. Since the late 1990s, this is no longer the case. Usually the land is given, if it's transferred from the government, usually the joint names of both titles, or to single women in the case of female-headed households. So I think that's a big plus. In laws, again, the 2005 Hindu Succession Amendment Act gave near gender equality to daughters and sons in joint family property, and especially in land. And I think this was a big move forward. There are some small inequalities remaining, but the major shift took place in 2005. So what did this mean? Earlier, women had rights only in their father's separate property, and even that could be willed away. But women were not co-partners at birth in joint family property like their brothers were. Also, land was treated very differently from other forms of property. So it was subjected to land reform laws. And every state had its own land reform laws. And these laws sometimes also defined how property should be defined, landed property. And they were very gender unequal, especially in northern India. So the 2005 amendment removed these inequalities. It removed the discrimination in relation to land, and it made women daughters co-partners by birth along with their brothers in joint family property. So, of course, there are unfinished agendas. So, for instance, in the Northeast, we have customary tenure systems, many of which remain very gender unequal, except perhaps in matrilineal communities like in Meghalaya. And then the 1937 Shariat Act is applicable to Muslim women, and that also needs reform for agricultural land. And notably, the southern states have amended it. We need an all India amendment like the Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005. So why are all these inheritance laws so important? Why am I talking so much? Because, 86% of agricultural land is privately owned. So families remain the main source of land for women. The other sources also exist, the state and churches, but the laws matter. And so an obvious question is, okay, well, we've amended the laws. What is the situation on the ground? So initially there was very little data on gender disaggregated data, but more recently there's been some. And I, among others, have analyzed different sets of data. So I found in my own research that across 9 states, in most of the states, less than 10% of women in landowning households owned land. And as of 2014, only 14% of all landowners were women, owning only 11% of all the land. So this means there's huge gender inequality. And also what I found very interesting in my very recent research, that if you trace who are the women who got this land, you find that they're typically widows who get the land from their husbands and not daughters from fathers. So, so you have the situation where the Hindu Succession Amendment Act has strengthened women's rights as daughters, but the traditional practice of privileging widows over daughters continues. And I think this gives you the sort of huge remaining space between progressive laws and social norms which continue, within which women continue to face huge disadvantages and a huge space for advocacy and activism.
Sure, no, definitely. And I think it's crucial that you mentioned that 86% of agricultural land in India is privately owned, which means pretty much the only way women have access to land is if they either inherit it. Is if they inherit it, because there is no way that they would walk into a market and access land in any other form or format. But you also did mention that there are alternative sources, and state is one of the sources. So if you'd like to elaborate a bit on that and how that links to women's access to land ownership.
Yeah, thanks. So, the government, of course, has, had land reform in the 60s and 70s. And then you had, that also meant that you took some of the land of the larger farmers. And then many of the common property resources also tended to be distributed in the name of anti-poverty programs. So that land was initially given to male head of households. But the policy has changed, so the government can certainly transfer more proactively land to women. There have been policies to do that, and I think there have been organizations working on the ground to make sure it happens. Much more of that needs to be done. But in addition, I think we can't close off the idea of market purchase, but it requires support for women. So for instance, you could have a loan cum grant scheme for land purchase. In the 1980s, actually, Andhra Pradesh had such a scheme. And the scheme was that Dalit women could buy land in groups and register each plot in individual names. So for instance, if 10 women got together as a group and they jointly applied for this loan cum grant, it was a 20-year scheme. And then then if you bought 10 acres, 1 acre each could be registered in each woman's name. So this happened in parts of Andhra Pradesh, and many of them chose to cultivate it in groups as well. So they didn't just register, they may own 1 acre each, but then if the 10 women were together, they would be cultivating together. And these were some of the early examples of group farming. And this was particularly supported by an NGO called the Deccan Development Society, which is still very active, but much more in terms of the millet campaign and organic farming and so on. And of course, the third aspect is markets are not just for purchase, but also for leasing land. Now, we know that in the land reform laws tended to, formal leasing was restricted and in some states is even banned under tenurial laws. And those tenurial laws have not really been changed. And but we know that informal leasing is very common. Now, so people do want to lease out the land if they're not cultivating it themselves, but they don't want to sign formal leases because under these laws, what happens is that if the tenant is cultivating for a period of time, then they acquire rights over the land. So landowners don't want to sign formal leases, and that there's been a lot of discussion on how to reform it. It's a challenge. But what it does mean is that, yes, leasing is an option. Informal leasing certainly is there. But even informal leasing, individual women rarely can afford to lease because, you have to negotiate, you have to get the funds for the rent. But it's been done quite successfully on a large scale, groups leasing in land. It's been done in Kerala on a large scale and on a smaller scale in Telangana, in Gujarat, and in Eastern India. Some of these initiatives, especially in the case of Gujarat, were a result of some workshops I had done, sharing my results for Kerala and Telangana with them. And then, so I talked to some of these groups today to see how they had, what had happened in post-COVID, and I can talk a little bit about that. But these examples of alternative ways by which women can access land must be explored.
And this is actually one of the things that a lot of people within the land rights space have been talking about, the individual ownership versus this kind of collective ownership, whether it's family, whether these are groups, the self-help groups for women, etc. But people coming together to own large tracts of land. So it's really interesting that you have figures and data to back up the fact that especially for women, it can be extremely beneficial. If we just have to take, and you did mention that you spoke to some of the groups that you had interacted with in Gujarat and in Kerala. So if you can just give us some of the examples of how the lockdown situation has if there are examples of women farmers during the lockdown situation, have they done well? What has happened to them?
Thank you. So just before I actually begin to talk about that, firstly, I'm not talking about women jointly owning land. There could be cases like that, but I'm talking about leasing land. There's some of them, so if you form a group, let's say if you have 6 women and 2 of them have small plots, but others don't, you could internally lease from them, but you also go out and lease land. You're not, there could be a few cases of joint ownership, but I'm not talking about joint ownership, joint leasing. The second is, I think I should explain before I talk about COVID, is what exactly does it mean? What does group farming mean? And I think it's important to to talk about this and explain it a bit, because for two reasons. Firstly, when you mention group farming, people say, oh, you mean cooperatives. And now the word cooperative is used in multiple ways, and often cooperatives have been marketing cooperatives. So no, I don't mean cooperative marketing cooperatives. I mean when farmers actually pool their land, labor, and financial resources, and they share costs and benefits. So you produce everything together. The second thing I want to mention is that people say, well, we tried it in the 1960s in India, and it failed. And of course, it failed then because we didn't really have a very good idea of how to conduct collective action. You had large farmers and small farmers, attempts to bring them all together, but they have conflicts of interest. Clearly, why should a small farmer then, the large farmer will dominate the group, and very large sizes don't work. Now, since then, of course, we know a great deal about collective action and changes. We have a whole experience of self-help groups. We have experiences of microcredit. We have lots of experiences of communities coming together to protect forests and water bodies. So today, we come from a very different space when we say, okay, people can come together and cooperate. So what kinds of benefits could we expect? Firstly, why would people want to come together and pool their resources? Because you can have, just consider 86% of India's farmers cultivate less than 2 hectares. 70% cultivate less than 1 hectare, which are very small plots. And there are diseconomies of scale. But if you come together, you could have economies of scale. You can save on hired labor. You can provide more skills than are possible in one person or in one household. You could deliver on contracts, and you could also increase bargaining power. So if a group is negotiating with a landlord to lease in land, it's very different from an individual person doing it. So those are all the potential advantages. And I think that's important to recognize when we then bring in the issue of success stories today.
Dr. Agarwal, just wanted to get your thoughts on some of the land leasing laws that have been passed in the last few years, and there's also a model tenancy act that has been doing the rounds in different states, and some states have been debating on it. How can some of these group-based models be a bigger part of these policy conversations, and also among groups trying out some of these livelihood strategies on the ground? How do you see the situation right now, given the results that you've seen in your pilot and what's going on in other states?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just briefly address that, and I'll come back to the actual models that I've studied. At the moment, the groups that I've looked at, the new tenancy laws have not come in place, and they are still negotiating under the old regimes. And so what you're seeing is that the women's groups that have been formed are signing predominantly oral leases. Now, as a group, there is an attempt in Kerala, for instance. So if you have oral leases, then you can't access government subsidies because you have to prove that you're a farmer. So one way around that is to actually give women's groups that, yes, a certificate, which could say, okay, they are a farmer. In credit, we have less of a problem because the NABARD actually initiated an all India scheme under which these joint liability groups could be formed, and after a certain period of time of operating successfully, they could apply for loan without collateral. So some of these hurdles, which were earlier linked to do you have land, do you have collateral, land as collateral, have been bypassed. But I think the bigger issue of does the owner have enough faith that the tenant will not get the rights over it, whether as individuals or groups, has not been bypassed. And for instance, in Telangana, many of these groups were scheduled caste women. And they found it very difficult to get the land, and most of the land was with the caste groups. So, I think we have to look at tenancy reform. But then I'll come back to some ideas I have on how and another kind of idea beyond the laws. But before that, shall I talk to you a little bit about the Kerala example? because that
Yeah,
links
if
to
we
COVID
could,
as well. Yeah.
We now have a bunch of questions, and I'm trying
Yeah,
to
but give me
Yeah,
5 minutes because I need to really share this example in relation to your previous question.
Sure.
I mean,
so I'll just collate the questions. In the meanwhile, you can go ahead and put forth the example, the Kerala example, and
so it'll take me,
then we can come back to some of these.
okay, all right. So I need a few minutes. Just by way of background, I mean, some of you may be familiar with it, but others may not. So in 1998, Kerala launched the Kudumshri Mission, which is a state poverty eradication mission. But unlike other states with anti-poverty programs, what Kerala set in place was an institutional structure for promoting all women's group enterprises located at the village level within neighborhood groups. And then they scaled it up to the village council level, which is the Kudumshri network. Now, one of the most important group enterprises was all women's group farming, where 4 to 10 women come together and they cultivate jointly, leased in land, and they pool their labor, etc. And they share costs and benefits. Now, what the Kudumshri mission also provided was training, organic farming, new practices. So what I did was I said, okay, let's compare the economic performance of these women's groups with individual family farming. And I collected very detailed data on all inputs and outputs for 2 districts for a sample of group farms and comparatively for individual family farms. Now, 95% of the family farms are male managed. And what I found was that the groups had 1.8 times the annual value of output per hectare and 5 times the net return per farm compared to individual family farms. So, so today we have like 68,000 such groups across 14 districts of Kerala. And what is very important in terms of the COVID crisis is that by Kudumshri's assessment, most of these groups have survived through the crisis and through the lockdown. So, for instance, there have been a lot of groups which were ready for harvesting the winter crop, but they had their own labor within the group, so they didn't have to hire in labor. And they sold the crops locally via state support. So, most of them survived, something like more than 80%. Then the vegetable growers, as you know, in the north, we have all these visions of vegetables being thrown away by farmers because they couldn't harvest them, they couldn't sell them. But here they could sell them locally, and also there were community kitchens which are set up across Kerala. So a lot of the vegetable farmers, women's groups actually sold their produce sold or actually gave away their produce to the community kitchens. So what you see is really a link. You have a sort of network of institutional structures which worked. And I thought this is important to recognize, because you're not just talking about group farming, but you also have to see that did it make a difference in a crisis like COVID. And then I was talking to the Gujarat group, which had been set up, there are 13 groups. And they said that they've survived because as a group, whatever they could harvest, they were able to increase food security by just distributing it within the groups. Whereas an individual farmer had to find markets to sell, and they didn't always find markets. So I can come back to other questions, but this is not just a Kerala experience. There's Gujarat, there is North Bengal and Bihar that's been happening, and some young men have in North Bengal and Bihar, young men have started forming groups instead of migrating to Mumbai as well. So given the current crisis with migration, I think I wanted to just mention that. So I'm happy to take.
So I think that kind of it kind of flows very nicely into a question that Sneha Pillai wants to ask, and she is. So I'll just read out her question, Dr. Agarwal. It's a lot better that way. What are the reasons for southern states doing more to empower women? Is it cultural? She asks. But I think you've already given examples of North Bengal, Bihar, and how essentially it is collectivizing versus individual ownership. But there is this perception that the southern states are doing a lot better, and that there is a particular idea about culture in the south being significantly different from culture in the north. So if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah, I think this is important. Of course, there is not a one-to-one link, but I dealt with it. I talked about it at great length when I was doing a field of one's own, because what was very striking was that even the initial reform of the Hindu Succession Act took place in the southern states, where unmarried daughters were brought in as co-partners. And also, if you see if you map parda practices, by parda I don't just mean veiling, but the idea of female seclusion, the non-access of women to public spaces, to markets, those are much stronger in the north, and you don't find them in the same way in the south. Which doesn't mean patriarchal practices don't exist in the south, but the very obvious markers don't exist. And also in the south, at least by social norms, you can marry within the village, you can marry within the extended family. So the kinship groups kinship is quite different in southern India than in northern India, and this is well recognized. So it does mean, take a young woman who's married into her own village. She has old friends. She can easily form an SHG and have a group. Take a woman in northern India from UP, and she's married miles away into stranger families. It's much more difficult to form social networks there. So I think there is an important north-south difference, which goes back to culture, to kinship as well, which does make a difference to women themselves being able to come forward much more, apart from whether the state tries to empower them. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, Dr. Agarwal. That's, okay. I think, definitely.
Raksha has gone off the side.
Yeah. We'll wait to see to get Raksha back. In the meantime, I was hoping to take a couple of the other questions that have come up. Particularly, so one question on how your assessment on how lower stamp duty or registration costs for women could incentivize more registration in women's names, or do you think even if that joint titling or that titling in women's names continues, there could be important barriers to women being able to use their land productively?
Well, it's a very mixed bag. Because many households will say, okay, because of lower stamp duty, this is especially an urban phenomenon, maybe in business families and so on. So you could say lower stamp duty, let's register the property also in the woman's name. But we really don't have adequate data or a good sense of the ability to control that. Because there can be a gap between ownership and control. We know that something can be in your name and then you can't actually make independent decisions on how to use that property. And this really comes a marker, say for instance, if a woman wants to simply sell it, would she be able to do that? So I think it's a good point. And your data will show that many more women have property, but whether they have independent claims to that, there will be probably a gap.
And I think Raksha is back, so I'll...
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what I missed, but I just want to check if the amendment to the Hindu Succession Act question was taken. Joseph Sebastian?
No, that wasn't taken. We just took the first question on stamp duty. Yeah.
Perfect. So, Dr. Agarwal, Joseph Sebastian wants to know, why aren't more reform policies focused on land? So people think with the Hindu Succession Amendment Act, the agenda is complete. How can we operationalize the amendments effectively? So I think the question is more to do with, implementation of specific pieces of legislation. So we do well when it comes to policy formation, but what about implementation?
Yeah, so that's, as I said, of course, we still have a way to go in terms of amending the laws for certain communities. But yes, implementation, you see, people have a right to private property. So if you take the Hindu Succession Amendment Act, then even prior to that, from 1956 onwards, a man's separate property, both sons and daughters had equal claims to it, but the man had a perfect right to will. So you could will away your property in the name of sons. And that's not possible with the joint family property. So that's a big plus. So for instance, if a person has a joint property and that by birth, both the daughter and son have equal claims to it, and the father can't will it away. He can will away his share, but he can't will away their shares. So then the question is, how do, in terms of implementation, I think it's very important that the officers who actually register claims don't have a bias, because remember, I do remember that a couple of decade and a half ago, panchayats, they would encourage women to give up their claims if they were daughters. And I was told that. I did a small survey in Rajasthan, and the panchayat heads would say, well, we discourage daughters from claiming their shares and we encourage widows from claiming theirs. So there has to be a great vigilance there. And I do know that there are groups which have been doing a lot of very good work on this. WGWLO in Gujarat, for instance, I'd done a workshop with them like a long time ago, 1.5 decades ago, but they then formed a whole network, and they've been training at the local level to trying to make sure, gender sensitizing the officers on the ground, that they must register the woman's share, and so on. We need to have much more specific data on this, to what extent it's been happening. Of course, if the other problem, as I think we all know, is that women have been pressured into giving up their rights. So they will sign away their rights. Now, it's not the government's implementation issue, it's really much more of a social issue. But the government does come into it. And how does the government come into it? If the same women had social protection, so women see that their brothers are their main social protection if they don't have parents. And they don't want to spoil the relationship with their brothers by claiming the rights. And often women say that, they say that all the time. So if we had a citizen-led social protection where everybody had an assured pension or an income or whatever, then they would be less fearful that they have no fallback position other than family. So I think we need to create structures for women where there are support structures which are outside the family, for them to be able to bargain better with the family.
Right. And this actually takes me to the question that I've been wanting to ask you. I work on land rights, but I work with specific communities. So a lot of my work has been in the field, where one tries to understand a community's reaction to policies that have already been framed, or legislations that have already been put in place. But you've been a part of, and a very significant part of, actually changing a particular piece of legislation, giving it, a very significant turn. So, if you just look at this issue from two different points of view, there are communities and then there are policies, and I'm just trying to understand which is an easier battle. Clearly, your experience both with the Hindu Succession Act and with the Sharia Act has not proven that changing policy is an easier battle, and neither is the societal and the community battles that a lot of women face at their own level. So I'm just trying to see if which of these is easier, in the sense that how can which can kind of pull the other one together, and how is it that we can then effect change by both the kind of battles coming together?
Well, you asked many questions, but firstly, I do want to say that in the process of amending the Hindu Succession Amendment Act, it was done. I did initiate the campaign and so on, but we did a huge consultation, because I thought it was very important that we consult many people on the ground. We had a whole day at the Indian International Center. People came from all over, and there were two partners to this. There was Colin Gonsalves, Human Rights Law Network, and then there was Milun Kothari, Housing and Land Rights Network. So there was a lot of consultation. So I think change requires consulting people who have insights from the ground. But it was somewhat easier because you're changing, there was no great disagreement on the direction in which the law should be changed. And since I'd already done a lot of research on it, I think there was a degree of trust in terms of what I brought to the discussion. But what we need to do is actually differentiate between policy and law. So, so if you take policy, if you remember in 2005, there were 4 different major acts. There was the Right to Information Act was also passed, and the so on. So that is a policy. So there's implementation instruments built into that, which is not the same as passing an inheritance law, or even if you take the Domestic Violence Act, because there are many different levels at which there can be gaps between the law and implementation. Policies are easier in some senses to monitor and implement.
Right.
It does.
The one of the sorry, go on.
No, I can't. I've lost you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Dr. Agarwal, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. So, great. So I'm just going to ask Shreya's question, which I think you've kind of answered. So she's asking about some states that have passed land leasing laws in the past few years. Has anything changed on the ground? That is, so you did kind of make a reference to the states that had passed land leasing laws and tenancy laws in the last few years. You did kind of mention about the changes on the ground. Do you still want to take that question? Is there anything you want to add?
I need to clarify that the tenancy laws were passed in the 50s and 60s, and they're embedded in the Constitution. So these are land reform laws. So they've been tinkering around that. What has been discussed actually over the last 2 decades, but also more recently, is the change in tenancy laws. Now, I do not know how which states have done that, because certainly in Telangana and Kerala on the ground, the women were still negotiating informal leases. So I think we need to see whether they have been passed, and is it reducing the amount of land available for lease. I had mentioned that I had an alternative proposal which I had put forward to the Planning Commission in the 12th 5-year plan, because I'd led a 12th 5-year plan working group on disadvantaged farmers, including women. And this was the idea of creating like a public land bank, which is that if you were in a panchayat in a village, if those who wanted to lease out the land actually deposited virtually in an office which was specifically created, and those who wanted to lease in the land could then come there and say, okay, we want so much of land, and so on. So there wouldn't be direct contracts, but it would be done through this mediating body. And that had advantages because it wouldn't create the kinds of difficulties which the current tenancy laws have created, and people would have less transaction costs in trying to either find somebody to lease out your land to, or finding land to lease in. Now it hasn't. Some NGOs have said they'd like to pilot it, but there hasn't been very much piloting on the ground. But if there are more questions relating to that idea, I'd be very happy to answer them. There was Parvesh Sharma and I had put this together, and we had published a piece in the Times of India. It's also in the report, which is downloadable from the Niti Aayog site for the 12th 5-year plan.
Right. There is a question. I'm sorry, I'm moving ahead slightly quickly, given we have about 15 odd minutes left. So there is a question on the importance. How important do you think is gender budgeting when it comes to land policy?
You know, it's a very different subject. Gender budgeting is a very broad subject. You can have specifically targeted policies relating to women in your budget, but you can also have general policies which need to be gendered. I don't think our existing gender budgeting has specifically looked at the issue of land for women. But I do think that it is important, especially vis-a-vis, that idea that I had put forward, which had been tried, which is how do you facilitate women purchasing land, and that you could have panchayat budgets allocated for that. So it could be built in. It hasn't been to my knowledge so far, and it could go for other asset creation as well, because if you take urban women, you might have other assets that vendors need, or women rickshaw pullers need. So there can be a link, and I think it's an important point to take up for the next budget. I do want to mention also that, Kerala had 10% of its panchayat budget allocated for women's programs. And that was one factor which enabled them to think specifically of how shall we empower women economically. And then when grassroots women began to say that, look, we have this idea, this land available fallow, we want to lease it and cultivate as groups, they said, well, that's a good idea. And so there was an openness to bottom up ideas coming in and shaping policy. And that also addresses your previous question on the importance of participatory planning.
Right. There's one interesting question which I'm tempted to take up, although I understand it's not particularly within the specific scope of this discussion. One of our audience members is curious to know, what about urban land rights in urban areas, women land rights in urban areas, and how is it that state policy can aid that? What is it that we need to do in terms of, pushing state policy towards a more gender balanced land rights in the urban spaces?
So yes, I think in urban areas, we're thinking less of agricultural land, unless you're talking about peri-urban. But in urban areas, housing is extremely important. And I think we've all said that, if you want to really increase women, enable women to participate more effectively in the labor force, they need better housing, you need hostels and so on. But on housing, I want to mention that this research that a colleague and I did, which showed that if women had land or house, there was hugely less risk of domestic violence. So there are many reasons why we need to enhance women's rights in housing. And again, I have talked a bit, and I would like to mention this, is that why do we always think of housing as individual? That if, say, I'm a working woman and I should have X amount lakhs in order to buy a flat. Is it not possible for a group of us to come together, if you don't have enough funds for individual flats, and buy a multi-room flat together, and with some common spaces and some private spaces? Now, this idea has to be architecturally pushed forward. It needs to become a policy when you have built all these high-rise and new structures, when you plan for housing, so that it is possible to have group ownership. And here I am talking about group ownership of apartments. I think they would be more affordable. We also need, and they should be subsidized for vulnerable women subject to domestic violence, women, poor women, who are working women, but need that. So that could be an innovation, which is allowing group ownership. After all, joint families own property together. Why can't women coming together own property together and support each other in a more affordable way?
Right. Is there an example that we could turn to, a successful example that we could turn to for this?
I'm afraid I don't know of any. I've come up with some of these ideas, and I hope there might be. Maybe some people in the audience who are listening might know of it or might be able to carry the idea forward. I have mentioned it in different forums, But sometimes when an idea is somewhat more radical, it takes time for people to absorb it and think through it. And maybe Raksha, you could promote it and take it forward. You're a journalist.
It's certainly an extremely interesting idea, and like you said, there are many parts of it that needs to come together architecturally, state policy wise. Gender needs to be considered. So yeah, a lot of things to consider and mull over.
Yeah.
Just the last question.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Sure. No, sorry, you wanted to add something on this?
No, I just want to say that, you know, when it just struck me that when you're building old people's homes today in Bengaluru and Dehradun and various other places, you know, people have their own spaces, but then they have joint facilities as well. So I think the idea of group, somewhat semi-group living is there. We need to transform it in a variety of ways. So go ahead, the last question.
Right.
Yes.
Right. No, so I was saying, let me just read out the last question, because that I think it's an extremely important question, and I don't want to rephrase it. So Ruchi Tiwari is asking, what about your thoughts on dowry as a substitute to land rights, where the daughter receives a part of her share in the family property? Also because the daughter would go to another family and she wouldn't be able to keep the land to herself. So I think she's trying to ask you about land substituting itself as, substituting land that's given to a daughter to be married, who's to be married as dowry.
So actually, you know, this issue came up. I actually address it in depth in my 94 book. And I think, you see, a right in property is a right. The dowry is not a right. In fact, we have a law against dowry. And there is traditionally, women have virtually never been given land as dowry. I mean, there have been, at least in India, there are few cases in South India, which I was looking at historically. And there are cases in Sri Lanka. But that's a very different system. But dowry would not be a good substitute at all for your rights in land or for implementing your legal rights, I would say. The argument that women go away to another, you know, if they get married, of course, this is much more in northern India than in southern India. Often in southern India, women may marry within the village or in the neighboring village, so it's not a big deal. But I can ask a counter question. Well, when men migrate or they take up jobs elsewhere, they don't lose their rights to joint family property. The brother who remains behind cultivates it and gives and so if you don't have to necessarily cultivate the land if you're moving out, but you certainly can have a share of the harvest. And I remember when I was doing research on Sri Lanka and I was in the Kandyan region, and I was asking women what they owned, and one woman said, I own 2 coconut trees in my parental house. And every year, you know, my brother sends me a bunch of coconuts. Now, you know, plots are very small in Sri Lanka, but that isn't, you know, the fact that she had a right to that little bit of land on which the coconut trees stood, and then the fruit which grew on the tree. And she said it with great pride. So I think I would still reaffirm that rights in land, in property, and implementing that and changing people's thinking about that is very, very important. Dowry can't substitute for it.
Right. Thank you so much for that.
Well, that's my view.
One more question, if you don't mind taking a last question. Sure. I'm just going to read it out as it is. Dhawan Nagar wants to ask, how can land right policies be used to augment panchayat finances?
Augment what?
Panchayat finances at the panchayat level.
Panchayat finances, I don't understand because...
Is Dhawan here? Is it possible for him to just ask us the question? Is it possible to unmute him for a second, or her? I'm sorry.
No, if you mean that can panchayat finances be used to promote women's land rights? Is that the question? Because clearly individual rights can't finance panchayats.
Right. Yeah, I think it. I mean, I understand the question. It is. It's trying to kind of take the policy down to the panchayat level. So, can the panchayats do something?
Yes, it can.
In order to. Yeah.
So yes, panchayats can do a great deal for promoting women's land rights. I mean, you can make sure, for instance, that in all the households in the panchayat, the women's shares are registered, and she's given support, so she doesn't feel compelled socially to sign it away. You can also create. So, for instance, also in many panchayats, what's happening is there is fallow land. With the Gujarat group I was talking to just 2 hours ago, they said that the Gujarat, the panchayat in the villages they are working, they said we'll give you panchayat land to cultivate. In many parts, villages in Kerala, the women's groups have cleared up, congested ponds, remove the water hyacinth, and the panchayat has said, well, you can free of charge, you can cultivate it for a year or for a season. So panchayats can be very important instruments, both to help implement the inheritance law, but also to give women access to resources and land that they have under their control. Absolutely.
Right.
I think I can just sort of add in there. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. We definitely learned from the insights that you shared, and I think this makes for a case for much longer conversations later on some of these ideas that you proposed. And surely there's a way for us to think about how to foreground women's rights as we think about land going forward.